Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in to our Google Hangout this evening titled Collective Responsibility and the Perils of Islamophobia. My name is Dr. Maha Hilal, and I am the Executive Director of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, which is an organization that primarily works to combat the post-9/11 counterterrorism policies, which have disproportionately targeted Muslims. So with that in mind, I'm excited to have with us four very esteemed panelists. What I'm going to do is to tell you a little bit about each one, and then we have a series of questions for discussion. And we also have a Twitter hashtag, Dismantle Islamophobia, so please do use it. Ask any questions that you might have as we go along through the conversation. So our first speaker is Rimaz Abdelkader. She is a Sudanese American who's currently a senior at George Mason University. She's pursuing a Bachelor's of Science in International Conflict Analysis and Resolution with a minor in Immigration Studies. She's passionate about conflict de-escalation, conflict mapping, and more recently the sociology of human rights. Moreover, she's also interested in how individual and/or the collective narrative plays a role in either bridging or widening the gap of understanding. Thank you, Rimaz, for being with us. Next, we have Shani Banks, who is a passionate Muslim American organizer in the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, and a recent recipient of her B.A. in psychology from the University of Maryland, where she also served as the vice president of the Muslim Students Association. Shani currently volunteers as an Islamic studies teacher, as well as a youth advisor at the Muslim Community Center in Silver Spring, Maryland. She has served on the executive board of the D.C. Muslim Interscholastic Tournament, MIST, for 3 years as program coordinator and writing and oratory coordinator. Shani has written numerous articles on issues and aspects surrounding Muslim identity and is a firm advocate for generating positive social change through creative and thoughtful innovation. Shani currently works for an international nonprofit organization under Johns Hopkins University and is pursuing a career in clinical mental health counseling to better serve Muslim American communities. Next, we have Tasneem Mutalla, and she's a third-year student at Yale Law School. Tasneem's area of focus is the intersection of criminal defense and national security. Her work experience has included representing and assisting with legal counsel for detainees held in U.S. custody in Bagram Air Force Base and Guantanamo Bay, inmates on death row, defendants charged for terror-related charges, and other victims of torture. She is broadly interested in international law and international human rights. She is executive editor of the Yale Journal of International Law and a student director of the Lowenstein Clinic for International Human Rights. She graduated from Yale College with distinctions in political science and ethnicity, race, and migration majors. She also holds a master's degree in social sciences from the University of Cape Town. And last but certainly not least is Amani Al-Khatatba, who is editor-in-chief of MuslimGirl.net. Amani began her post-college career at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, where she was employed as a media relations specialist for a year. Amani is the founding editor-in-chief of MuslimGirl.net, a blog aimed at eliminating stereotypes surrounding Islam and promoting the place of Muslim women in Western societies. So thank you all for joining us again. Without further ado, I want to start the discussion by, I guess, what seems like it might be a more basic question, but it's actually really complex and has a lot of nuance. That's Islamophobia. As you know, there are lots of terms that I think are meant to describe this phenomenon of Muslims being feared, Muslims being hated, Muslims being targeted. So what in your mind is the definition of Islamophobia, and how does the use of this term differ from other terms such as anti-Muslim racism, anti-Muslim bigotry, etc.? And anyone can hop in.
I guess, sorry, I just opened. I guess when we think about Islamophobia, that homophobia is happening. So Islamophobia then refers to an irrational feeling. I think that if we were living in a utopia, to mark that fear of Islam. But because of a society that is very good at actually selling fear to people, people not completely seen as special anymore. So there is in a rationality. So it's kind of interesting to see how to use the word Islamophobia be inappropriate or completely inappropriate or completely context or the socialization or the visualization of your goal.
Since you guys are just starting to speak now, could you just say who you are, your name, and your affiliation?
Sure. My name's Amani. Again, I'm the editor-in-chief of Muslim Girl. I think that one of the primary criticisms that I've been hearing around the term Islamophobia is that it alludes to a fear of the religion Islam, when in actuality what it's describing is the fear of Muslims. A lot of people have suggested us saying like Muslim phobia instead. Obviously, a lot of people have chosen to refer to our experience as anti-Muslim or anti-Islam bigotry, but in my personal opinion, I think that it's very semantical, and I think that the word that we choose isn't necessarily like one is better than the other. I think they're all describing the symptoms of a horrible new strain of racism that we're experiencing in modern history right now, especially in Western societies, as it pertains to Muslims. And I think that it describes our collective experience of kind of being the scapegoated minority community at this time. So I personally don't have a problem with it, but I understand where the concerns lie.
Okay, great. And I guess one point of clarification here is when we think about the term, it's important, right, to define the problem, right? It's important to define the problem and have a shared understanding, because the strategies that we'll talk about later on depend in part, right, as to how we're defining the problem. So if others have thoughts on that, that would be great.
Hi, this is Ramaz Abdulgadir. For me, I feel like, back to what Amani was saying, that it's really, I think what Islamophobia has become is that it's become synonymous, where you make the distinctions between Islam and violence and just make them one terminology. For me, it's not necessarily, the fear of Muslims, it's the fear of a violent ideology that they practice. So that is what the majority of the people who I've, kind of identified as Islamophobic. It's this, their bigotry or their anti-Muslim speech derives from their fear of the ideology, which they see as inherent or promoting violence. So I think how we define those who speak in that manner is very important, because that could give us, the tools to kind of counter their narratives on what they see as an inherent ideology, and begin to use that same platform to provide, again, a collective narrative that speaks to what mainstream Muslims practice and what their ideology is truly about.
Sorry, this is me. I'm from Yale Law School. Just to add on to what some of the people have said before, I think what makes Islamophobia particularly different than other sorts of racism is that the idea of Islamophobia is that Muslims are kind of a distinct threat. We're different. We're kind of not just an other, but also like an outside other, something like that. When we think of Islamophobia and we think of Muslims, we think of terrorism. We think of a foreign group that are trying to, they're infiltrate America, invade America, and it's kind of looked at recently in a war era phenomenon. So it's a little bit different from, I think, other forms of racism, but ultimately I think, like with Islamophobia, it's kind of the same system of discrimination and racism that we've seen towards other groups in American history.
I think that maybe even inconsequential. I'm like hearing my echo. I don't know where it's coming from, but I think that it might be a little bit inconsequential for us to even discuss, what terminology we're going to use and where the root of the problem is, without us taking into consideration the way that these issues have been covered in the media. So we can all say, like, day in and day out, you know, like, oh, we shouldn't say Islamophobia because it's not pertaining to Islam, the religion. But the fact of the matter is that the media convolutes that. And it's impossible to have a conversation around some type of violent ideology or followers of violent or radicalized ideology without making it centered around the Islamic religion. And, you know, we don't even have to look further than social media, for example, to see that, right? Like, in the midst of all these conversations going on around the presidential candidates and the elections, one of the primary things we hear from people or that we see tweeted or what have you is always, you know, well, you're following a really violent, you know, ideology, or, you know, Islam teaches you this, your religion is telling you to act this way. And meanwhile, we're basically attributing any type of progressiveness that we have as a community to our westernization rather than it being born from the concepts of the religion that we follow. So, you know, like I said, I think that it is really semantical in our part because we can address the problem and say that it has to do with these specific radicalized, like, minority members of a wider, like, radical movement. But the fact of the matter is that Islam itself is being targeted, and by extension, the followers of that religion, which is Muslims at large.
Great. So does anyone want to add anything before I move on to our next question? That's definitely, Amani, thank you. That's great fodder for discussion. So, you know, the goal of this particular hangout is really to go a little bit deeper than what I've seen a lot of the narratives and discourses and discussions go into with Islamophobia, right? So in particular, my next question is about sort of the psychological underpinnings of Islamophobia. So what are they? There's a vast literature in terms of conflict resolution that attempts to, you know, look at the sources and roots of intergroup violence, conflict, etc. So what role does that play in understanding Islamophobia? We have a lot of elements of racism, jingoistic racism, nationalism. So how does that help us understand Islamophobia the way it's manifested at this point in time?
I won't be able to get too much into the psychology of Islamophobia, but I think what makes Islamophobia particularly compelling right now is that it also serves like certain foreign policy interests. So you see this idea of, like I said before, Islam being portrayed in vis-a-vis our kind of foreign policy goals, our being the United States is, and, you know, kind of being able to promote this Islamophobia both at home, saying there's this, you know, this domestic threat, but then also this need for foreign intervention. So I see Islamophobia kind of playing a foreign policy objective.
Okay, great. Does anyone else want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that as far as that we feel, kind of a rough frame of Islam, if you want to at the actual phobia, is like a lot of aggressive and for specific people. I think they were all three. I think that if we're talking about it psychologically, a lot of the reasons why this happens is because I think as human beings, we have to be able to tie our fear to something. So if you can't tie your fear to something tangible or like a tangible body, then you're not great. So it's kind of like in that sense. So we in American tradition, this idea of identifying a social or economic issue and tying it to a group of people, usually a minority, and then attacking that group of people as a means by which to conquer that fear, or to conquer that, you know, economic depression or whatever it is that's kind of lurking over America, you know, abstract or otherwise.
So sounds like we're having a little bit of a hard time hearing Amani. So Tasneem, or Shani, you just spoke. Ramaz, do you have anything to add?
I had a hard time with Shani. But what I wanted to, in particular, what concerns us here is that the social representations of Muslims and Islam's like practices and values are placed on one hand, and I feel like with like the realistic threat of terrorism and how people are becoming more Islamophobic and are beginning to afraid and fear Muslims because they, again, like I stated earlier, they believe that Muslims practice this inherently violent ideology. I think that it psychologically, I think that it is can you hear me? So as I was stating, that the positions of Muslims and Islam are beginning to be seen as threatening the beliefs and values and the cultural practices and the physical well-beings of Western nations. This is how I see the psychological underpinnings of Islamophobia.
Amani, do you want to add something?
No, actually, I think that you pretty much covered exactly what I was trying to say before my voice went out. So,
so one of the ways that I've thought about this is through this idea of moral exclusion, and not to get too theoretical here, but there's a theory of moral exclusion that's been proposed by a scholar named Susan Apatow, and it's really about how different groups become expelled from who we consider to be part of our moral community. And once they are expelled from what we consider or who we consider to be part of this moral community, then our ideas about fairness and justice no longer apply to them. So I'm interested in knowing if you guys have any follow-up thoughts on that. In that, my mind, the goal of all this rhetoric and the negative social constructions of Muslims is really to position, and you've all talked about this to a certain extent, right? To position Muslims as others and to position them as outside of who we consider to be part of a particular community that we can identify with. So does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think from a legal standpoint, you do see a great departure from the sort of morals and laws that govern our interactions abroad. I think you can see this most blatantly with the policies towards drone usage. These are effects that these are policies that only affect Muslims, and I think you can kind of see, like, when we refer to drones and drone strikes, we refer to them as terrorists. We refer to the civilian casualties as just an effect of war. I think there was a great discussion about this not great in a good sense, but there was a large discussion about this last night at the Republican debate. And when you can so callously forget about the casualties of drone usage, whether they're American citizens, they're minors, and they're all Muslim, it's easier for us to implant those policies in the United States as well. And we've seen a slow derogation of civil liberties and due process rights for American Muslims. But once again, this is following on a wider system of criminal justice that's affected Black and brown people for centuries.
Okay, Amani, can you try again? Okay, so unfortunately, we're having a lot of difficulties with the technology, but we'll see if Amani can get back on and chime in. Does anyone else have anything to chime in terms of answering this question? Okay, so the next question I wanted to get at is really this idea of collective responsibility and collective punishment. And in my mind, this kind of underlies a lot of what we see happening post 9/11, and arguably long before then. But what really is the role of collective responsibility slash punishment and/or punishment in the perpetuation of Islamophobia? And how is this manifested both in terms of the state and society?
I was going to add that I think that with the media representation of these issues, there has been a very strong implication on the perceived identity of Muslims. As my other friends here stated, that we've begun to label Muslims who are not as extremists as like moderate Muslims, and I think when you label other Muslims as moderate Muslims, you begin to identify again Islam as like this ideology that adheres to violence. So naturally, people are expecting Muslims to kind of condone the violence, to become apologetic for the actions of those who committed the crime. I think this is when you have this collective responsibility. Personally, if I can add, I think it makes me frustrated because what they're asking us to condemn is something that is of its nature, it's inherently violent. Like we did that right after 9/11, and we continue to do that whenever there occurs a terrorist attack here or in any parts of the Western world. There's a perception that Muslims must come out and condemn these violent acts. And if I could ask other panelists, what is your perception on that, and how do we, counter their narratives of constantly asking us to be apologetic?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that you said. I feel like it really kind of set in for me when, I heard our president kind of assume this sort of intimacy between the American Muslim community at large and, people who are doing these, really, really violent acts. And hear him kind of expect us to be able to kind of preempt that and be able to undo whatever is, I don't know, whatever is, I guess, is happening to create these kind of terrorist ideologies or whatever. That there is that kind of intimate relationship. To make that kind of assumption was really jarring. To hear that come out of the mouth of our president and kind of announce it, not only for us but for the entire world, and him saying that, really legitimize this relationship that's there between us. And I thought that was really really incredible. Yeah, I don't know if anyone has anything to add on how do we respond to that specifically, maybe.
Tasneem or Amani, would you like to respond to that?
Can Yes. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything that was previously mentioned. What I was trying to get at earlier before, I really don't know why you guys can't hear me, but basically that a lot of what we've seen happen with Islamophobia is a result of the dehumanization of Muslims. And, you know, that has taken place overseas in the Middle East to perpetuate our foreign policy and kind of drive support around it amongst the American public. But by extension, obviously, that impacts the way that Americans view Muslim Americans as well, and that clearly has pervaded the presidential elections as we see today. And unfortunately, you know, of course, we saw the same thing, you know, surface in Obama's statement. And I'm not shocked by it at all. I think that when it becomes almost acceptable for a current presidential candidate to be able to go out there and say that we're going to stop all Muslims from entering the country and incriminate the Muslim population as a whole, then it's only a matter of time before we see, you know, that be reflected in institutions just as much as they've always been. It's just becoming seemingly more mainstream now, and I think that the public is kind of waking up to it. I think that at the very least, like Donald Trump's comments, for example, kind of really shined a light on the height of Islamophobia today. It really showed the level that things have gotten to. I think it was the first time that the American public started to recognize, like, okay, we're starting to sound a little bit like Nazi Germany. Maybe it's time for us to pull back. Maybe the situation is that bad for Muslims in America right now. So it's definitely a double-edged sword. You know, we're on the receiving end of a horrible double standard. But I think that this is the first time in my life since 9/11 that I've witnessed this support rally around the Muslim community in the United States, and I think that that is a hint at where we're going. That there is a lot of potential for us to use these opportunities to our advantage as a community, and to really harness that greater understanding and increase of tolerance amongst our neighbors.
Yeah, I think Amani said it perfectly. As a conflict resolution major, we study the stages of genocide. And the actual ethnic cleansing and genocide is actually one of the last stages. It's the last stage of genocide. It's the 10th stage. And when you said dehumanization, I was like, maybe you should get an honorary degree from my university, because that's literally the third step. The first one is when you classify and you begin to categorize people. And then the second stage is the symbolization. And Donald Trump wants to give Muslims IDs, right? So that's perfect. He's doing it there. Discrimination, we've seen that certain stores are no longer offering Muslims into their businesses. They're saying no Muslims allowed. We saw that in Nazi Germany, where they had no Jews allowed. Dehumanization, when you begin to deny the humanity of one group over the other. And the next stages, which I hope don't come, are organization. And you know, it's when you begin to organize these systemic ethnic cleansings and genocide. So this rhetoric is very, very dangerous, because in the beginning it may seem like, you know, that it's all fun and games, and some Muslims may even laugh at it. Like, I was having coffee at this place next to my university 2 weeks ago, and I ran into this Lebanese Muslim guy, and he was like, "Hey, you're the Bernie girl," and then I laughed, and he told me that he was voting for Donald Trump, and I was like, "What the hell?" And he said that he's voting for Donald Trump because it's very funny, and that none of this stuff will happen true. No, this stuff, we have to take it very seriously, because it may start with, you know, just like the ideas are so outrageous that we don't think it's true, but you know, these ideas have been true, and if we just need to examine our history. I think Tasneem probably has a lot more to say about this, but I'm taking a course on race and ethnicity, and I've seen that the dehumanization step is very crucial to not just you know, committing genocide, but you know, labeling a group as one thing or another is very dangerous. Like the Japanese, or the African Americans, or the Native Americans. There have been groups in the past that have been in our narrative as a United States that have been marginalized and exploited, and it all began with this kind of rhetoric. So I think it's very important to recognize it and to stop it and call it out as unconstitutional. And Donald Trump's wanting to, you know, ban Muslims for coming into America, you know, it's that in itself is unconstitutional. But when you put it in within, you know, this rhetoric that they are a threat to our national security and things of that nature, other Muslims, not other Muslims, other Americans are very much afraid. There was this one thing that I learned that has kind of stayed with me, and it's that when you're in this perpetual state of fear, your ability to make informed decisions and critical decisions is diminished. So if you're standing in front of the TV, or if you're scrolling through Facebook and you're constantly seeing Muslim killers as the headline of, you know, mainstream American newspapers, there is no reason for you but to fear. So it's very crucial that we, stomp Trump's rhetoric, get rid of it, eradicate it from the beginning, speak to it, counter it as forcefully as possible, and make it known that Muslims are leading the forefront fight in reclaiming their narrative. But it's not only up to us, because how much noise can we make? I think it takes national acknowledgement that we are already doing what needs to be done, and I think our president, Shani, needs to do much more.
So I have a follow-up question to that, and then if you wanted to answer this question or want to elaborate on this as well. So in terms of the rhetoric, especially with Donald Trump's, right, there's been a lot of fixation on what he has said, right? We should ban Muslims from this country. We should require them to have special IDs, etc. I haven't been as troubled by the rhetoric, only because many of the policies that have been instituted post 9/11 have instituted these very measures, right? So we started out with the special registration program, which systematically targeted Muslims from different countries. Different programs such as the exit entry program, which required special measures for individuals from specific countries to undergo, you know, extreme measures to be able to leave or enter the country. So while it is nonetheless problematic that Donald Trump is saying these things, what he's saying is actually something that's been embedded in the policies that we've seen since 9/11. And when we see politicians coming out and speaking out against Donald Trump, these are at the same time the same politicians that are voting time and time again for policy and law that institutionalizes discriminatory measures towards Muslims. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. So another way of thinking about this, right, is what weight does the rhetoric hold in terms of when we understand the actual actions that are taken by the state?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you on that. The other day, I read something about how all these candidates are coming out to condemn Donald Trump, blah blah blah. But then actually, one of the candidates that took a really strong stance against Trump's Muslim comments was at the same time attending a conference that was being hosted by one of the biggest Islamophobes. So really, it doesn't matter what they're saying. We can't take lightly that we're in the middle of an election year, right? And we're in the middle of these election campaigns. And I think that that's why, Trump would not have made those comments if he didn't know that it would energize some type of voter base. And at the same time, I think that the other candidates are going by their constituents as well, and what would be the most, acceptable for campaigns and things like that. But it really doesn't mean
Okay. Does anyone else want to respond to the question while we get Amani connected back?
Maybe now's a good time to just talk about the current laws that are in place, because I think it ties into your earlier comment about the rhetoric, but the rhetoric's actually deeply embedded in the laws that we have in this country. And yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, Trump's statements seem fringe, but the core of what he's saying, that Muslims are a threat, they're kind of this distinctive group that should be treated in a special way, the Constitution does not apply. This has been in place in this country since 2001. It's not something new, and it's something that we're seeing in various different measures. I can speak in great detail about all of them or just kind of list off a couple of different things. But I mean, I think first we have Guantanamo Bay, the most explicit example of a separate system of justice. Guantanamo Bay only hosts Muslims. There have never been any non-Muslims in Guantanamo Bay. Any sort of legal process is effectively denied to them. They can visit the DC Circuit Courts, but they've essentially eviscerated any chance of them ever having a real say in court. We've seen an increase in federal terror charges. Most of these cases have been procured through a process of entrapment. The people who are being entrapped are usually poor, oftentimes mentally disabled, sometimes minors, oftentimes Black. Their ability to access legal counsel is prevented. The law on entrapment is particularly bad. When they're actually arrested, they're prevented from getting their Miranda rights. The evidentiary standards are not the same. When they're actually put into jail, they're held in solitary confinement. They're all not able to access or speak to their lawyer in the same way any other criminal defendant would be allowed. So it really is a complete separate system of justice that's been ingrained in this country since 2001. And this whole notion that the Democrats aren't as bad. When Obama came in, there was a new era. That's absolutely not true. This is the Department of Justice that's instilling or creating these laws. I could speak in greater detail about a lot of other things as well, but I think that kind of gives a broad overview of how deeply embedded these policies are. Trump's rhetoric is frightening, but it's not that out of whack in comparison to what's been going on for quite some time.
Amani, did you want to respond? We lost you at the end of your last comment. Or Shani or Rimez, did you guys want to respond to this? Okay. So, we're about halfway through the Hangout, and I want to be sure to address some of the interventions to Islamophobia and some of the discourse that we've talked about previously. So one of the things I want to talk about in particular is the ways in which the Muslim community experiences violence that's perpetrated towards them, both by the state and by society. One thing that's often very neglected is the ways in which the Black Muslim community experiences the violence in particular. This is something that is not only not addressed, but is left out of significant discussions, especially because of sort of the monopoly of the discourse by Arabs, Desis, and other Muslims. So I'm curious just to know if you could all speak to that.
So a couple things. I think it's true there's this troubling tendency of the American Muslim community to invisibilize Black Muslim voices, and particularly when we talk about the government violence towards Muslims, you completely disregard the fact that when you think about a lot of these really well-known cases of police violence, Amadou Diallo, Mamaya Abu Jamal, yeah, there's a couple other ones, but these are all Black Americans, but also they're Muslim, and I think that's completely disregarded when we talk about examples of coercive state violence. Secondly, I think when I briefly touched upon the issue of entrapment, and we've seen sort of entrapment occurring against a lot of Black Muslim communities, and the reason behind this is that they're poor. Oftentimes, a lot of Black Muslim communities don't have the same sort of legal counsel, access to resources, and they're heavily policed. And so that's why it's easier for FBI agents to come in and serve as undercover agents and trap a lot of our Muslim brothers and sisters occasionally. And so that's another element to this. It's a kind of this intersectional issue of both being Muslim and being Black. So the almost doubly, we all know the criminal justice system does not treat African Americans the same as they treat everyone else. So add Muslims to that, and it's quite the disparate effects are really apparent.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also just kind of want to speak a little bit more onto just the erasure of the African American Muslim narrative. I think that a lot of the times when we talk just about the Muslim community and our responses to these kinds of events or the backlash that we get, we really leave out the African American Muslim community. And I say African American Muslim community to talk about a specific segment of the Muslim community because I feel like saying uh, Black American Muslim can be kind of broad. So just kind of to narrow it down a little bit. Um, so yeah, I completely agree with everything that you said, and I've said this before that it feels like just being kind of an African American Muslim person, you feel kind of like every day like what are they going to be attacking today? Like why am I in the crosshairs today? Is it because of my blackness? Is it because of my religion, or is it because of my gender? If you're a Black Muslim woman, um, so and then it's hard to kind of overcome that violence against your body or to overcome that rhetoric that's against you when you're in the shadows, when you don't exist, when you're being pushed out and your narrative is being erased. How do you overcome violence against your body when people are telling you that you don't even exist? So I think that's something that definitely needs to be addressed more often. But that being said, I definitely, just me personally, am going to continue to be a part of the fight with my Muslim brothers and sisters. Despite race, Arab, Desi, like I'm right there with you. But I definitely think that we need to be more cognizant of our African American Muslim community.
Well, I can't speak and say, what is the narrative for an African American since I am an African immigrant. So it's very similar because there isn't a distinguishing factor that you're labeled as an African immigrant or an African American. But as an African and a Muslim female, as Shani just stated perfectly, you again, you're not really sure which parts of your identity is attacked. Like I go to the supermarket and someone looks at me funny. I'm not sure if she's afraid because of my Muslim identity or is afraid because of my skin color. And I think that we do have it the absolute worst. But I think just engaging in dialogue with the perceived, whether it be microaggressions of racism or whether it be very overt, just maintaining that openness. Personally, what I personally believe is to continue to talk to those whom are openly engaging you in this conversation. But what do we do to address when it becomes structural, when it becomes structural violence, which it has? There isn't much on an individual level that you can do. That's all I can say to that.
Amani, did you want to add anything? It looks like we lost Amani again. Although she has a comment for us. Do any of you, Shani or Ramaz, do you guys want to address what Amani said? 'Cause I don't want to perpetuate the problem by saying it myself.
What was the comment?
She's basically saying, that a lot of the issue of anti-blackness, they're centered or sort of seen as relevant or worthy of discussion when they come from non-black Muslims. So in other words, obviously what does it mean and who's really, we don't need a non-black Muslim to speak for a black Muslim or an African Muslim, an African American Muslim. So if you guys want to comment on that, that would be great.
Rimaz, you look like you're I need to think about it a little bit before I'm ready to respond.
Can you hear me? I wish she could say it herself, but I think it's so true. Honestly, it took me a long time to realize that there was racism within the Muslim community. I'm really sad to say that because there are such incredible examples that are found within our religious texts that are used to tell us that no, there isn't any racism within Islam. You know, Bilal is guaranteed one of the highest levels of paradise, and you know, how can you claim that there is racism within Islam? Like, I have a personal story, and I love to tell stories, so I don't want to take so much time. But one of my first experiences with this black Muslim racism happened when I was in Saudi Arabia. And I wasn't a pair, but I grew up in a very sheltered neighborhood, a very sheltered community. I very innocent as a child. I wasn't really aware of, you know, these prejudices and this discrimination that was happening. And I was so confused because I went to the Holy Land, and here I am being treated as someone less than because of my skin color. And when I came back from Saudi Arabia, I was there for an entire summer in 2011. I was hosting an event, I think it was like one of the Arab Spring events on campus. And this I think it was Saudi actually, or from like the Middle East, was telling this other guy in Arabic, because he perceived me as African, therefore cannot speak the language, therefore Islam is not my deen. I probably, you know, just got it. Three, you know, different perceptions, and began to insult me in Arabic, and he told his friend to move out of the way. If I can repeat it, he said in Arabic, "وخر وخر خلي السودة تمر قبل ما تطيرك," which in literal translation is "move, move, let the nigger pass through before she blows you away." So that is when I had, you know, my second experience within the racism within the Muslim community. And it's very sad to see that the issues only become legitimate when you have non-black Muslims that bring them up to surface, that want to address them, and it's very sad. And I love that when we have Muslim activists that stand in the forefront of this issue and bring them to surface. But sadly, you know, I think when a black Muslim tries to address these issues, they're seen as paranoid. Similar perceptions when black people try to say, look, you know, there's discriminations that are happening against me, they're just like, no, you know, you're just perceiving that. I'm sorry, that was a rant, but that's how I feel. This is my daily life story.
Yeah, I think you absolutely nailed it. I don't have that much to add. I think that there's that hierarchy that exists, or that perceived hierarchy that exists, you know, of, I guess it's not perceived then in that case, of privilege, because privilege does exist, where, you know, the more privileged person sees the lesser privileged person as, oh, you're just complaining, oh, you're just making it up in your head. It's not real, but it is real, and it's unfortunate that it takes, you know, someone who's not black themselves to have to say, hey, this does exist, and then everyone is able to rally around it after them. I should be able to, you know, reach out to people within my community, people outside of my community, and say, hey, this is a struggle that I'm facing. This is something that I'm going through, and I should be able to be believed. I should be, you know, I should be supported in that. You know, I shouldn't, you know, be, oh, she's just the angry black woman kind of thing. You know what I mean? So it's really unfortunate, but it's definitely something that is here and something that we're dealing with.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I think that it's intertwined, right? I think that because of the Muslim community's inability to kind of be able to identify that Muslims can also be black too, and that when we talk about issues affecting the black community, we're completely negating the fact that the identities aren't mutually exclusive. Like, you're not either black or you're Muslim. Like, a black Muslim identity exists, and it's left out of the conversation. And I think that it's reflected also in the way the mainstream regards the Muslim community, right? Like, it's no coincidence that all of the Muslim women that I see that are in the media and that are speaking on behalf of Muslim issues and things like that are light-skinned. And it goes into also like the public perception of what a Muslim looks like. Like, being black is already a huge lack of privilege in and of itself, and then on top of that you throw a headscarf, and it's a double whammy, and the fact that she's a woman's already an issue, so that's a triple whammy right there. And for like the public eye, for example, it's literally too much for people to even chew. Like, they can't comprehend the image of like a black sister also in a scarf, also like empowered and speaking the truth to power and things like that. And that's why I think a lot of times we see it left out of the conversation. It's a double-edged sword, and that the Muslim community itself is incapable of rectifying that identity, and it's reflected in the way that we deal with these issues and the way that we respond to them, the voices that make it to the forefront and the ones that are left behind. And it's a sad state of affairs. And you know, it's sad that Black issues are only legitimate to the Muslim community when they come from non-Black Muslims. And I think that that's why it's so important for people that are in those positions to be able to put Black voices at the forefront, because first of all, they're entitled to be especially around Black issues, but even more so because we need to be able to you know, put people in those positions that typically don't have, like, we need to pull back on our privilege too and be able to check it and recognize it, and then use that to the advantage of the rest of the community that needs to be in those spaces as well.
Does anyone want to add anything before I sort of transition to the next question, but keeping in mind what we've just discussed? Okay, so what I wanted to sort of address next, because I know we're getting towards 8, is really how do you all conceptualize the sort of Muslim American response to Islamophobia? This could be both on an individual level or on an organizational level. So how do you conceptualize the way they're responding? This also takes into account, of course, the ways that they're not responding, the ways that, for example, they're not including Black voices in the discussion. So how do you understand the ways in which they're responding? Do you think it's appropriate? Do you think it's effective? And if it helps, I can give an example. And I'm thinking more along the lines of on an organizational level. So the ways in which Muslim organizations have readily sort of jumped on the bandwagon of condemning acts of terrorism. In many cases, and in particular the latest example with the San Bernardino shootings, in many cases framing the act of violence as an act of terrorism prior to even the media going down that path. So how do we conceptualize this response and conceptualize the voices that are or are not included?
So, like,
Well, I mean, I can share my insight.
Yeah, please do.
I mean, as an individual insight, I go back to, you know, grassroots mobilization and the power that, you know, having dialogues can be really sufficient to address Islamophobia within, like, the community that you're in. And for example, like at my university, we've had like I think 3 so far, community dialogue circles where people from different student organizations came out to discuss, you know, the rhetoric that's going on in the media and how other groups can become allies to our cause. So where we can voice to them that, you know, that what is going on is hurting us, not just it's hurting us on a personal level. I personally just would propose that for us to have these these dialogues within our communities and within our schools. That's one of my first steps that I've seen, that if you are able to kind of come to an understanding with those who are in your immediate community, in the place in the sphere of, you know, where you work or where you go to school, I think you feel much safer, you feel much more welcomed. It's sad that, you know, we have to do something like this, but it's become I think it wouldn't be a good idea to not engage in the dialogue and to just, you know, hope that someone else is gonna take going to take action and have these conversations that need to be had. Like, for example, I requested from 2 of my professors if I could use, the last 20 minutes of our class conversation to just talk about what's going on in the media. I mean, the students that are in my class are all conflict majors, but that doesn't mean that, they think the same way, or they have a different perception of Muslims, or they haven't bought into what the media is saying. And I think at the end of the day, it depends to your personality as an individual. How you are as an individual differs in how you will what you think is a viable way to address these issues. You may think that having these conversations is a bit apologetic or having to explain yourself, but I think just giving them the basic teachings of Islam, like that's what I'm doing in my classes, and telling them that this demonizing language is making people is what perpetuates this hate and this misunderstanding and the distancing and the creating of us versus them mentality. So I guess for me it's like just dialogue on all spheres.
Amani, did you want to add something? I thought I saw you.
Yeah. I guess, Ramaz, you literally said that everything again that I wanted to say, but, I guess it really does come down to the whole being apologetic thing. I think that that's, for me, the biggest pet peeve that I have about the way that the Muslim American community just so naturally responds to these types of issues when they arise. And I think that we're getting better at it, but it's kind of hard when you have, like, for example, we just talked about President Obama and him putting the onus on the Muslim American community to condemn and try to address and take care of the situation of terrorism. But it's like, how are we supposed to drift away from that apologetic narrative when it's literally being imposed on us even by the president, right? And I think that really does come down to us just being taking up space as Muslim Americans and really being certain in our identities and our belonging into the society. For many of us who were born and raised here, like, this is our life, this is the only country that we know, and it's kind of empowering ourselves and moving with that confidence of that belonging. I think that that's what will make all the difference, that we're entitled to the same rights as everyone else living in this country, and we're entitled to be able to walk down the street without fear of being attacked for our religion or our color or our gender.
Something else I think is also key is just knowing who our allies are and working with them. And there's so many other movements right now that I think that have the same goals as us. I think Black Lives Matter movement. I think a lot of people are working like prison reform, people working on just like reforming the criminal justice system. In terms of the law, I think our ultimate goal is the same, and our problems are the same. It's a systemic discrimination within the legal system. And I think when we can recognize our allies and we can mobilize accordingly, we'll have strength in numbers. And I think that's also really key in specific aspects of I guess Islamophobia.
Yeah, I feel like you guys covered all of the bases mostly, and I just kind of wanted to mention specifically our youth, Muslim youth, because I feel like we spend a lot of time taking care of, like, okay, we have these Islamophobes that we need to take care of. Okay, we have like these people who feel super apologetic within the Muslim community that we feel like we need to take care of, or even have ourselves that we sometimes need to go back and take care of. But we also have our youth, which I feel like we sometimes neglect because they're being brought up with all this rhetoric about themselves and their identity when it's already so difficult to be Muslim and to be young and try to be cool and in high school all at the same time. And like now you have this extra layer on top of it. I feel like it's really important to try to be a role model and try to just be proud and stand tall in your Islam and be okay with it. Not battling with that, and just being a very strong role model for the youth is something that I feel like is very important, because the way that they respond to it a lot of the time is the shedding of their Islamic identity, or the shedding of what they perceive as their otherness, and that's not something that we want to encourage, of course. So I think that it's definitely important to pay attention to them and their needs and try to cater to that as best we can.
So something I think I want to follow up a little bit in terms of the response from the Muslim American community is really in particular the condemnations and apologies. I know that often people sort of distinguish the two in terms of the semantics or what calling it one thing or the other really means. But I think what I want to talk about a little bit more is sort of the Muslim American narrative, right? Muslim American narrative that not only is inclusive and includes all those who compromise the Muslim American community, but also what does that do to the narrative, right? So when Muslim organizations in particular come out and condemn acts of violence or acts of terrorism, they frequently conceptualize it or frame it as a counter-narrative. In my mind, that is not a counter-narrative, because a counter-narrative should exist to disrupt the fundamental premises of the dominant narrative. And so what are we really doing, or if anything, in shifting the narrative if we continue down the line of condemnations and apologies? Does that really change the Muslim American narrative?
Toni Morrison had a great quote that I posted on my Facebook the other day, and it's about how, responding to racism is hard work because, you can do all these different things. And at the end of the day, the system of racism in place will never accept any of those as being enough. I think her quote was something like, first they say you don't have a language, so then you have to invent a language. Then they say your brain is different, so you have to have scientists proving that your brain is no different. Then they say that you have no culture or dance or whatever, and you have to show that you do have all those things. And that's the trouble with racism, right? It's never enough. No matter how much we condemn, no matter how much we say that we're different, it's never going to be enough. And by kind of responding along those lines, by buying into that system, or buying into that idea that we have to constantly respond to these terrorist attacks or condemn them or whatever, we're buying into a racist premise. So yeah, I don't give that premise. I don't give that credence. I don't feel the need to respond to whenever something occurs that happens to be done by a Muslim.
Amani? So this is unfortunate. Again, we cannot hear Amani. But Shania Remez, did you want to respond?
I mean, Tasneem put, the computer just froze. Tasneem did a really good job with that. As an individual, I personally don't apologize. I don't, because I don't see the need for it. I mean, like, if someone falls and now I'm just going to give analogies. Let me stay away from that. But I don't. I just focus on being the person that I am. I don't try to prove my peacefulness to nobody. I don't try to prove to the extent of how nice or non-violent I am. I just be the person that I am, and I be the person that my religion encourages me to be, and that is me. And I think that when we are condemning these acts and coming into the media and constantly are being asked to take a platform and say no, these are not something that is Muslim. I think, like you stated, this is not really countering the narrative. Like it's not really countering the narrative, and you've actually just put that idea into my mind because I've never thought of it that way. The whole countering the narrative perspective. I mean, I've seen that as a way where you can delegitimize that these actions truly stem from Islam. I see that Amani wants to say something, but my computer's frozen, so I can't say it. Can you mute my mic because I can't click on it?
So let's see if Amani can hop on. Otherwise, in the meantime, Shani, do you have anything to add?
I don't have anything to add. I can just reiterate. I too, I don't feel the need to apologize. I do really focus on just consistently just trying to be a good person, to put a good face on, to not be disillusioned by all the stuff that's happening and all the rhetoric that's around us, and just to continue moving forward. And that's the most I can do. I can continue to engage with people around me. I really make an effort, I think, not to be insulated, especially like within the Muslim community, to reach out and to talk to people, to engage with people, to have a seat at the table, be at the table, be a part of these decisions that are happening, engage with people. I think that's something that's really important. There's kind of just basic steps to take.
So with that in mind, one thing I also wanted to discuss is really about what are some interventions that you all have found to be effective towards Islamophobia. And I think, judging from a lot of the interventions that have been used in Muslim communities, whether it's, hosting a panel on, Jesus as a prophet in Islam too, to some of the more basic ideas, what are the things you think really work? And when you think about work, what are the ways in which we can measure success? Because a lot of times we have to really move past the idea that if only they knew us, they would like us. We really have to get past that. They may work for a margin of the population, but what do we do when it's something more serious than that? And especially in a climate where there's such an amount of fear, and it's contrived fear. How do we really engage people in understanding Islam and understanding Muslims, and not just being tolerant, but understanding that we deserve to be here, we are rightfully here, and we are citizens.
I think that social media is really effective on that front. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, so what I was getting at before that I guess links into this is that I think that in terms of the reactions, like the way the Muslim American community responds to these situations, I think that the Chapel Hill shooting was a turning point for our community. I think that that was that kind of like forced us to teach ourselves how to quickly organize and quickly respond to these situations when they arise, because that was kind of like a wake-up call, right? Like it actually does come down to life or death. And I think that we saw a shift in the Muslim American community's addressal of these issues from being reactionary to now starting to be more organized and being proactive. And people are taking it upon themselves to create campaigns, to hold these different events, to try and, I guess strengthen the public relationship with the Muslim American community and things like that. And I think that social media is huge in that regard. I think that for me, the most successful campaigns that I've witnessed have taken place on social media and have been, viral campaigns in that way because of how accessible they are and how vastly able they are to reach different populations and really cross boundaries and make things more relatable. So for me, as biased as this sounds, I'm really into creating our own media and doing things to get our own narrative out there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be apologetic or reactionary or responsive. It could just be existing and having that presence and that visibility. I think that really does go a long way.
I feel like implicit in this discussion we've had is that there's like this endless loop, right, of Islamophobia. There's the media feeds off of fear, the masses kind of buy into that fear, the politicians propagate that fear in order for their strategic advantage. The law enforcement, and asking for more funds will then use that fear in order to say, like, there is a need, and then it kind of creates this endless loop. So I really like Amani's suggestion about social media, and I think that's absolutely key, because right now, if you look at the major media networks, there's no way that we can really, provide our voice in an effective manner. If you see like kind of the talking heads that are there to represent Muslims, we're given 30 seconds at max, and it ends up becoming like a screaming contest, or we are reduced to dumb conversations about is Islam like peaceful, or is ISIS Islamic? And it's never going to be a productive space for us to have a conversation, for us to shift the discussion. But with social media, it's all in our hands. And alhamdulillah, I've seen some major shifts in social media, and it does seem to be kind of like the key in order for Muslims to regain our space, or to gain our space. I don't know if we ever had it, to gain our space and to change the narrative.
I would also add, with using social media, which can be a great tool, is to pair it with accessible language when we're speaking to people, because if we're speaking to people who already don't completely understand Islam, or whoever it is we're speaking to, then we need to use relatable language, or we need to use terms that are relatable. You need to use just human, just everyday language. I feel like a lot of times we tend to gatekeep our conversations between groups that are already very familiar with it, or people who already feel very similarly. But I think it's very important to extend that, and a good way to extend that is to just speak in layman's terms and just just be normal, basically.
Okay, sorry about that. I was on mute. So I was going to say one thing I wanted to go into deeper, using the North Carolina murders as a jumping point, is the fact that I think in many ways it was easier to galvanize the Muslim community, Muslim American community, because the three individuals that were unfortunately murdered were good citizens. They were they had good characters. They were, by all accounts, really amazing individuals. And so for the Muslim community, I think that really struck a chord in terms of, wow, even when you're a good Muslim, even when you're a contributing member of society, this can still happen to you, right? So that's one point to keep in mind. The other point to keep in mind is, when it is a Muslim who may be accused, or not even accused, right, who could be under surveillance, who could have some sort of cloud of guilt cast over them, what do we do in those cases, right? Even if there is some kind of guilt or suspicion of guilt, how do we respond to that? Because does that mean that they should be targeted in the way that they're targeted, right? We see a disproportionate amount of targeting towards those individuals, and at the same time, this is doubly problematic because the Muslim community does not want to speak out and assert their rights because of what has been cast upon them. So I'm wondering if you guys can comment on that.
It sucks because I feel like in those situations, Muslims are basically convicted by the media, and it's just the guilt is basically thrust upon them, and people just take it for what it is. And that's like what just happened today, right? So the FBI revealed that the alleged San Bernardino shooters, the Muslim couple, they've never publicly affiliated themselves with ISIS or a terrorist cell or organization or anything like that. But that didn't stop the media from just running with it, right? Running with it. And the damage has been done. They implicated all of Muslim America in that way. We had the president go and make those comments as a result of it. So the damage has been done. It's irreversible at this point. And I think that, unfortunately, also with the Muslim American community, we're always hesitant to come to the defense of these individuals, or to make a public statement saying, like, wait, maybe we need to hit the brakes and wait for more information to come out. Let's question what's being said or whatever. We don't give Muslims basically the due process that they're also entitled to. And I think that also it comes from a place of fear, because Muslim Americans in general, like, none of us have due process in this country, right? It only takes one terrorist allegation for us to get shipped to Cuba. And that's a reality that we have to face, and that's why a lot of Muslims are hesitant to speak up in these situations or place themselves in the crosshairs. So then when character assassinations happen and Muslims are vulnerable to being affiliated with a terrorist organization or like jihadist intentions or things like that, that's always the first casualty, right? It's always guilty until proven innocent, and even when it is surfacing that maybe these individuals have less guilt than was originally implied, it's already too late at that point, and it takes us to it literally just takes us back even further from all the work that we've been done to alleviate the situation in the first place.
And I just want to add one quick example, and that was of Osama Rahim, who was a black Muslim who was shot and killed by the FBI. He was under surveillance, and there were no charges against him. There was actually no evidence of any wrongdoing, and he was shot in cold blood. A black Muslim was shot in cold blood, and no one spoke out because of these allegations that were unsubstantiated. So I think we really need to examine not only the content of our responses, but the timing of our responses and to whom we are responding to.
I think I come from a pretty biased perspective doing defense work, but having seen most of these indictments, having seen quote-unquote evidence levied against detainees in Guantanamo, having seen the sort of intelligence that's being used in order to imprison Muslim people, I mean, there's not much there. As Amani said, the due process rights, evidentiary standards, the sort of rhetoric that's used when prosecuting or not prosecuting Muslim detainees or inmates or defendants, it's completely bogus. In any sort of just criminal justice system, it would not hold weight. So it's something that Muslim communities really need to think about when they're not only formulating responses, but also when they think about their relations with government and with the FBI. And it's a lot of times we let the FBI and NYPD into our mosques because we don't want terrorism in this country either, but we also need to hold them accountable to make sure that they're not affecting our rights and our Muslim brothers and sisters' rights too. And just to reiterate a previous point, a lot of times these people who are being surveilled are mentally ill or very poor or don't speak English. It's the very vulnerable members of Muslim society which are being affected by these cases and these policies. So as Muslims, we need to protect them in whatever way we can.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that Tasneem touched upon, right? It's that even if they are being watched by the government, that doesn't mean anything because we know how horrible our intelligence is in the first place and how uninformed they are. Like, just at my alma mater, Rutgers University, that's where I'm coming at you from right now, right? On campus, the NYPD had a surveillance cell, and they were literally extended from New York into Jersey on a college campus. And they had the entire Muslim Student Association under surveillance. Students, they were infiltrating their white water rafting trips and taking notes of how many times these individual students were praying their salahs, right? So think about it. Think about who are the Muslims being watched. It can even be like a college kid that's minding their own business that happens to be of a Muslim background. They're being targeted for their religion. They wouldn't be watched for any other reason. And funny enough, that surveillance cell that the NYPD had on campus, the only way that it was discovered was because it was mistaken by bypassers as a terrorist cell, because it was just like monitors and electronics everywhere, right? So for us, it's always terrifying to hear, oh, well, the FBI was already watching them. Oh, the CIA already had them on like whatever list or whatever. But what does that mean? I wouldn't be shocked by hearing that, because I'm pretty sure they're watching a lot of Muslims across the country, many of whom are not even aware that they're being watched, and it has to do with their religious identity. And unfortunately, like when we hear that, when it comes to a media frenzy like the one that we just experienced, or that we just endured more accurately, that's always the line that is thrust about, right? It's like, oh, well, the FBI was watching them anyway, so like, of course it's them, of course they did it. But that's never actually the case.
And also in a related point, now this whole idea about, oh, if someone's on the no-fly list, then they shouldn't have access to guns. I'm all for gun control, but this whole idea that if someone's on the no-fly list, they must be guilty of something. The same standard to put someone on a no-fly list is, it's, I think, reasonable suspicion, which is the same standard that we use for like stop and frisk policies in New York. So I mean, it's what is a reasonable suspicion? You're all Muslim, basically.
I think a lot of Muslim Americans are not aware that they're, first-class citizens. We consider ourselves, I know my parents do, as second-class citizens and are not well aware of our rights, our First Amendment right, our ability to practice our religion freely without, this fear. I think if Muslims are aware and begin to embody their identity as one that is deserving of their, First Amendment rights and other rights, as equally as everyone else, then I think we will begin to have a different perspective on how we see each other and how we see the infringements on our own rights. I know that for a fact, like after the whole Bernie Sanders situation occurred, there was an article that was written about me calling me an Islamist by Barfed Croft. It's like some outlet, and they've literally written articles about Linda Sarsour and some of the biggest voices about countering Islamophobia. And this same website was actually cited by Donald Trump, saying that, remember when Donald Trump was saying thousands and thousands of Muslims in New Jersey were celebrating, and how majority of newspapers and that theory was debunked. This same site wrote an article to say that what he stated was indeed true, and this same site targets Muslim voices to get them to be afraid. And I honestly was afraid. I came to class, and my professor was the one who discovered this article, and he was like, "Oh, Ramaz, well, congratulations, you're on the FBI watch list." And my whole classmates started laughing, but it's in the back of my mind. And I think if I wasn't in this field, maybe if I was a science major or something else, I would be even much more afraid, because I think that the community in itself, at least the community that I'm in, there's a lot of people in the community that perceive themselves as second citizens, that second class citizens, that they will never be fully American, even if they were born here, or second or even third generation American Muslims. So I think it's very important for us to assume self-responsibility and get educated on our rights, and to know that this is not right, that this is infringing on our constitutionally protected rights, and we're important just as anybody else is.
Shani, did you want to add anything? No? Okay. So we're actually at the end of our time. So the last thing I want to do is just give you guys a chance to make any closing remarks. So basically, one question would be, where do we go from here? We've seen really a rising tide of Islamophobia, right? And in the last few weeks and months. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here knowing that ISIS, for example, is going to continue to be a point that's used in the Republican debates, presidential debates, anything of that sort? Where do we go from here? How do we curb anti-Muslim violence? How do we take care of our community? How do we shift the narrative? Anything, I know I've thrown a lot at you, but anything you have to say, and sort of what are the next steps, and what do we need to do to keep the Muslim community safe, aware, and conscious, and assert their rights in the society in which we exist?
I think that one thing that we really need to do, and we can't afford not to, is to remain really unapologetic identities in our experiences. For me, for example, a lot of the media that I've been speaking to regarding Muslim women and the targeting that they're experiencing in the aftermath of all of this has been describing what Muslim women's day-to-day experiences are. Something as simple as the fact that Muslim women have mentally conditioned themselves to stand away from the subway platform, for example, for fear of getting pushed on them because of wearing a headscarf or because of they look visibly Muslim. These are little ways that our everyday lives are literally disrupted by Islamophobia, and we've just become so used to them that we overlook them very easily. But these are the experiences that we need to speak to, because these are the ones that, for many of the people that I've spoken to and that I've shared these experiences with, they open their eyes and are just like, wow, they never realized that it was this bad. And I think that speaking to those experiences, and also remaining just really fearless and voicing our identities and how important they are to us and how in line they are also with our Americanness, I think that's what humanizes us, and I think that's what makes all the difference.
I think Amani just, said everything that I wanted to say. But I think it's very important that we remain apparent and we remain involved in having these dialogues. I'm sorry, as a conflict resolution major, it's all about dialogue. I think we need to continue to talk. I mean, what I've seen on social media are conversations that I didn't think were to ever be had. SubhanAllah, like, although that we're being currently torn in the media, there are other people who are being educated about Islam, and I think that is one of the biggest da'wah. Those who are seeing, these atrocities and are saying, like, I can't really believe that, a whole religion, the fastest growing religion in this entire planet, preaches such hate. And then I think that in itself perpetuates them into or encourages them to go and research the religion on their own, and then begin to, I hesitate to use the word counter after Yuma, but begin to have these discussions online, back and forth. SubhanAllah, again, I don't want to mention the Bernie Sanders thing, but after that happened, I've had people message me from all over the world. I'm talking about people from Belgium. I had this one guy who was a Jewish professor at their local university who had an entire week on educating his students on what Islam is and what they can do in their communities and in their neighborhoods to counter these this rhetoric. So I think we need to keep talking, and I think when we keep talking, we inspire this. Let's keep this movement going. I read something that said that this is the second civil rights movement for because of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think it's the second. It's another civil rights movement for many minorities, and me being the dichotomy of both, me and Shani both, the dichotomy of both, being Muslim and Black. I think it's very crucial that these conversations are to be had. So one day, inshallah, that we are able to, destroy structural violence and destroy the systemic exploitation of our people. So let's just keep the conversations going. Let's keep them going.
Yeah, I agree. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in a hadith that Islam, began as something strange and it will become strange as it was in the beginning. So blessed are the strangers. And I think that's something that I definitely carry around with me. It's empowering to me, and I think that it's important to continue to be empowered because it helps you to continue to resist. And I think that resisting is something that's really, really pivotal right now, is to continue to do that and to not stop resisting, if that makes sense. So it's something to continue to, power to the pillars, right? Something that we need to continue to do, something that we don't need to give up on. Definitely take care of yourself. If you need to step away and take time to just do some self-care, that's perfectly okay and perfectly something that we should continue to do, but definitely continue to resist, continue to have these conversations, continue to engage with your peers, within your community, with the outside of your community, and keep the discussion going, keep the dialogue going, and keep up the momentum.
Just to echo the previous points and echo something I said earlier, is just reaching out to our allies, knowing that there are systems on place or groups, grassroots movements on place in the ground that are there, that we can tap into, that we have the same goals as, because we're stronger in numbers. And like I said, this isn't just a Muslim thing. It's something that I think is systemic in America. America has been treating minorities poorly for centuries. That's what it was built on. So I think tapping into those networks is crucial. And I think also just not taking anything for granted. The laws and policies that have been in place since 2001 are, we've kind of taken them for granted to an extent. I think at this point, we think surveillance is something that's like kind of a foregone conclusion, but not accepting that, we will be policed, not accepting that, Black men are going to be shot on the streets, not accepting that drone strikes are going to occur. And I mean, that's the complacency is what allows us to continue. So pushing back against each of those things and not allowing our rights to be eroded further than they already are.
So thank you all so much again for being on the panel. I'm truly amazed, honestly, at the breadth and range and all your responses. And I hope one day, inshallah, we can have an in-person panel and invite you guys back. I would love to hear more of what you have to say about Islamophobia, and I definitely look forward to working with you all in the future. So thank you again, and have a great night.
Good night. Good night.
Thank you for coordinating.